And what we're talking about, and will be talking about today, is the long historic 19th century. Now, one normally would think that the 19th century begins in 1800 and ends in 1900. But these are just artificial figures which very rarely coincide with historical epochs. And so one does make reference to something called the long or historic 19th century, and that effectively runs from the 1770s until 1914. Very quickly, what happened in 1914? A very basic piece of historic information. Sir? The outbreak of World War I. Thank you very much. Now, Carpathian Rus, which we looked at last time, you have maps that you begin to study. I'll be giving you more, and I'll explain that subsequently. We know that we are in the heart of Europe, geographical center of Europe, and that during this long 19th century, these lands were part of what was known as the Habsburg Empire, which is clearly marked on your syllabus as the lecture of today. And so what we want to look at before we can move further during these few lectures that deals with the, in a sense, long 19th century background to the short 20th century. What is this Habsburg Empire? What was it when these Carpatho-Rusyns now find themselves living in it during the last quarter of the 18th century chronological, or the beginnings of the long 19th century? Well, in the simplest sense, the empire was a relic from the Middle Ages. One shouldn't look at that as a negative comment. It's just reality. Sometimes relics last much, much longer than innovative items. And this relic from the Middle Ages was a period when royal families acquired territories as part of their personal patrimony. This is important. When a royal family, a king, an emperor, whatever, got territory, this was personal. It was theirs, their personal property. Now, the family in question, in the case of what we're talking about, was the Habsburgs, who, beginning way back in the 13th century, in the 1200s, and beginning on Germanic territories in what is today more or less the western and southern parts of present-day Austria, and then eventually with a base in the city of Vienna, which is the capital of Austria today, in the middle Danube River. They gradually expanded their rule so that by the end of, or I should say the outset of, this long 19th century, Habsburg possessions were in territorial size second only in Europe to the Russian Empire. And so if we're looking at a map at the beginning, more or less, of the chronological 19th century, the pink is the Russian Empire. Here are the yet-to-be German empires, just individual states. And here's the Austrian Empire and the Ottoman Empire to the south. So these are the three big elements in Central and Eastern Europe. The Russian Empire, Ottoman Empire to the south, and smack in the middle, the Austrian Empire. Just to give you an idea of its extent, because if we're looking at historic maps, it's difficult to gauge. Not to say that you have a map of Europe, contemporary Europe in your head, but I'm going to do it anyway. This Austrian Empire, as we're looking at it here, Hambsburg Empire, Habsburg realm, comprised what are today the entire countries of Austria, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Hungary, Croatia, and aside from those entire countries, substantial portions of present-day Romania, in particular the area called Transylvania, northern Serbia, or the Vojvodina, and parts of present-day Poland and Ukraine. And added to all of that, also a substantial part of what is modern-day Italy. So you can see the Italian boot here. The light blue is, in fact, these Habsburg realms. Now, where the Habsburgs were to lose most of its Italian lands in the second half of our historic 19th century, on the other hand, it gained a province called Bosnia, or Bosnia-Herzegovina, which turned out to be problematic, as we're going to see. Now, the inhabitants of this, or these Habsburg domains, were as diverse as its territories, or the territories under its rule. The major languages that were spoken by its inhabitants: German, Hungarian, Czech, Slovak, Polish, Ukrainian, Slovenian, Serbo-Croatian, or more properly today, Serbian and Croatian, Romanian, Italian. And aside from all of that, these were really only the major languages. There also appeared on the empires, and all of those major languages actually appeared on the empire's paper currency for equality's sake. You think that Canada was the first multinational or multicultural place? Forget it. But aside from all of those that I just mentioned, there were also numerous other languages spoken, including Yiddish, Romani, the language of the Roma or the Gypsies, Armenian. Now, that's, in a sense, human geography. Political geography, the administrative structure of this realm, Habsburg realm, was initially complex. Why? Because each new territory that was acquired over the centuries, and remember this empire went back to the 12th century, every time they got a new piece of real estate, if you will, that new piece of real estate could have been a kingdom, or a grand duchy, or a duchy, or simply a city. Each of those new acquisitions, more often than not, kept their own traditional customs and, most important, political administration. Now, the most distinct territory within this Habsburg realm, distinct among other things because it was the largest and, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, self-governing, was the Hungarian kingdom. The Hungarian kingdom. And so when we look at this map, all of this light blue is the Habsburg realm, and here's the Hungarian kingdom, which is clearly the biggest chunk. If we look on a slightly more modern map in the second half of the long 19th century, all of this is the Habsburg realm, but this is the Hungarian kingdom within it. So clearly a very dominant place within the framework of the Habsburg realm. The non-Hungarian portion of this kingdom, or this empire, did not really even have a name. In effect, and in reality, it was simply a conglomerate of historic territories, or provinces as they were known, Länder in German, Bohemia, Moravia, Galicia, Upper and Lower Austria, Vorarlberg, Tyrol, Salzburg, Styria, Carniola, Istria, Dalmatia. And then, as I said, for more than half of our long 19th century, the Italian or the Italianate provinces of Lombardy and Venetia, Parma, Modena, and even as far south as Tuscany. These were all Habsburg lands. But that's in that part of the realm that had really no name. And for want of a name, historic literature often refers to all of these diverse provinces as simply Austria, or the Austrian half of the Habsburg Empire. So we have the Kingdom of Hungary, that's clear, and then we have the rest, which is kind of like grouped together under this vague term Austria. When immigrants came from this area, they then were recorded in Canadian or American statistics as Austrians. They had nothing to do with the Germanic world. They could have been Ukrainian or Romanian or whatever. Now, with regard to these various provinces that I've just alluded to in this Habsburg realm, many of them had their own elected assemblies, or firstly appointed, subsequently elected, made up of representatives of what were known as social estates. One belonged to a social estate in those days, and the only social estates that counted in this early period were the clergy, magnates and gentry landowners. And each of these estates, individually and together, struggled to preserve a certain degree of local self-rule or autonomy in the face of what was going to become, certainly from the very beginning of our long 19th century, as we are going to see, the ever-growing bureaucracy and central governing administration in the imperial capital of Vienna. Now, at the head of this entire realm was the monarch, a member of the family of Habsburg, who was assisted by several governing boards, known as chancelleries. All of the appointees to these chancelleries were made by the emperor, who in effect was the ultimate authority in what, for all intents and purposes, was an autocratic state in the Austrian part of this state. Now, Hungary, the Kingdom of Hungary, that big chunk of it, had its own diet, a diet that was elected by the Hungarian nobility. But the authority of the Hungarian diet over Hungary's affairs varied, and it always varied depending on the political fortunes of the Hungarian kingdom vis-a-vis the Habsburg central administration in Vienna. So we always have, from the very beginning, this kind of rivalry between the Hungarian kingdom and the imperial authorities in Vienna. Who controls what? All right, from this brief overview of the structure of the Habsburg Empire, let me not leave you with the impression of a motley conglomerate of territories, conglomerate of these differing peoples and languages that seem to be held together simply by administrative structure, military force, or one might also say just simply natural human inertia, since the vast majority of us are totally passive to the states and governments in which we live. You as students still sometimes have some interest, but the older you get, the less interest you're going to have. Hence, political inertia. But, so, was this conglomerate just held together by force or by inertia? Well, no. There were indeed several factors which contributed to a sense of unity within this variegated empire. And by the way, the number and the influence of such what one might call integrating factors continued to grow during this long 19th century that we're talking about, of the 1770s to 1914. And some of those factors prevailed to the very end of the empire, which happened 4 years later after World War I in 1918. And some of those factors even after the empire didn't exist. And what were those integrating factors? Well, one of them was the Habsburg bureaucracy. Which exists in every state, as we know. This bureaucracy under the Habsburgs was actually an efficient and an even honest, if sometimes overbearing, instrument of Austrian rule. You could do nothing within the Habsburg Empire, and many of its successor states after the Habsburg Empire didn't exist, unless you had a document with a stamp. And I've just ruined my connection here. Because stamps, that document, very important. You had to have the stamp. And of course, the bureaucrat who gave you the stamp was obviously ultimately quite self-important. But it was an honest bureaucracy. It was a fair bureaucracy. Other factors contributing to this sense of integration or unity was the legal system, that is, the rule of law, the army, by the way, in which every male was required to serve, no exceptions for health reasons, this, that, or whatever. Everybody had to serve equally. And of course, the other integrating factor were schools. The schools, of course, provided universal and compulsory education, as we're going to see, at least at the elementary level. All of these institutions, the bureaucracy, the legal system, the army, schools. All of them together provided a sense of imperial Habsburg patriotism among all of the inhabitants of this vast realm. German was the official language of the administration and the upper levels of education. And I say Germany, forget Germany. When I say German language, forget Germany. This has anything to do with Germany. We're talking about Austria, and we're talking about the Austrian Empire, okay? So keep these things separate. But the language, in fact, was German, which became a kind of lingua franca, common mode of communication for those elements of the population, whether administrators, whether as intellectuals, whether as merchants or artisans, even some peasants who needed a means of communication that could be understood by other citizens or subjects, to be more precise, of this empire. So the German language, in sense, became somewhat of a unifying factor. At another level were certain symbols of imperial culture that became embedded in the psyches of the empire's inhabitants. Architecture was one such tangible symbol. There's a great book called When Architecture Speaks. You don't realize how important architecture is on your daily lives. Now, it is true that you walk around Toronto and most of it's in international style garbage, but if you just stick in this little bubble here, you know, it's quite nice that you see these pseudo-historic styles with trees growing around them and ivy on the walls and nice places to sit on a day like this. This just doesn't happen by chance. It's by design. And so architecture, very important within the framework of the Habsburg realm. And the architecture and the environment became embedded in the psyches of the empire's inhabitants. And so, by the way, there are cities or portions of cities as far away as, and just think, each of these cities is now in a different country. Milan, we know that's in northern Italy. Budapest, Bratislava, Krakow, Sarajevo, Lviv, Chernivtsi. If you go down, still today, every one of these is in a different country. If you go down to the central portion of these cities still today, some of them are totally indistinguishable from each other, as well as from the buildings in the imperial capital, Habsburg capital, Vienna, which they copied. Every one of these cities has to have a theater on the main square, because theater and opera was crucial in the course of this long 19th century, and they're all built in the same style. So you can stand and say, where am I? Am I in Krakow in Poland, or I'm in Milan in northern Italy? And then at the more popular level, very rarely probably do people listen to classical music anymore, but if you do, and this is pop classical music, at the popular level, the waltzes of the Strauss family, the operettas of Johann Strauss Jr., the Hungarian-born Franz Lehár, Emmerich Kallmann. By the way, in Toronto, we have an operetta company, believe it or not, which is incredibly rare in North America, that performs these things. These operettas and these waltzers provided, in a very real sense, quote unquote, the national music of the empire, since their melodies were probably as well known to all inhabitants of the empire as was their local folk music. And finally, the Habsburg emperors themselves became undeniable symbols of unity, and in some cases close to quote-unquote national imperial heroes for several of the empire's differing nationalities. And this was certainly the case with regard to the 18th century rulers Maria Theresa and, chronological 18th century, Maria Theresa and Joseph II. We're going to speak about them. And even Franz Joseph, who ruled for an incredible 68 years from 1848 until the last years of the empire in 1916 during the war, and during a period which was the height of nationalist passion among all of these various peoples, even he became for many inhabitants an imperial Austrian Habsburg symbol to be respected, even revered above the national and social conflicts of the late 19th century. So you could see his portrait even after the empire no longer existed in many peasant huts throughout the former empire in the 20th century. The point of all of this is that despite its enormous heterogeneity, the Austrian Empire succeeded in creating a sufficient number of unifying and integrative elements so that Habsburg rule became an acceptable social and political framework for most of its inhabitants up to and even after the outbreak of World War I that closes our period in 1914. Though this is a history course, I try to stay away from dates so that you're not overwhelmed, but nonetheless, these two dates should stay in your mind. And in the case of what we're talking about, one other one now, 1772, because we did say that this long 19th century begins in the 1770s. So in 1772, this was the year in which all Carpatho-Rusyn inhabited lands now were in the Habsburg Empire. Of course, those south of the mountains had been in it already way back into the 11th and 12th century, but now those in the north were part of this Habsburg Empire as well. But more important, when that date occurred, the empire was headed by rulers who were determined to reform their realm. And those two rulers in question was Maria Theresa, a female. As we're going to see throughout this course, females usually are the most effective rulers. She ruled from 1740 until 1780. And her son, Joseph II, who ruled from 1780 to 1790 by himself, but already in 1765, he had become co-regent together with his mother in preparation for him ascending to the throne. And therefore, as co-regent, when many of the reforms that we're going to look at were actually implemented, some of them were inspired or carried out by him while he was still together with his mother, co-regent. And for that reason, their reigns together, which encompassed, as you can see, virtually a half a century, have come to be known as the era of Theresian and Josephine reforms. Both mother and son were enlightened rulers. If you see the dates and you know even something remotely about European history, this was the period of the Enlightenment, which was a pan-European phenomenon inspired by French intellects, but nonetheless, by the way, the daughter of Maria Theresa, hence the sister of Joseph II, was the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette. That same one that we know what happened to her. So this is the world in which we are operating. They don't have enough wheat and bread, give them cake to eat, as they said. And we know what the revenge of the populace in the revolution of 1789. Now, both mother and son, Maria Theresa and Joseph II, were convinced as enlightened rulers that the good of society, any society, but they're concerned with their own society, the good of society as a whole depended on the proper functioning of the state. And a successfully, properly functioning state depended on the ability of each inhabitant to serve the state. And in that regard, Emperor Joseph II always liked to quip that he was simply the first servant of the state. Do any of you like music? Do any of you have heard of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart? And you know that when the young Mozart, from where? The Habsburg Empire, originally from Salzburg, but then in Vienna. And, you know, he's this great talent. And the emperor at the time was an amateur musician. You know, Mozart met with him many times. There's a famous portrait of little young Wolfgang sitting on the knee of the emperor who pretended that he was a composer. Well, who was the emperor? Joseph II. This is the context of this. And so, these enlightened people, I'm a servant of the state, we're all servants of the state, said he. And those servants or subjects of the state should know that they are protected by the law, and that in order to appreciate the role of the state, each inhabitant must be literate. And so it is not surprising that the Theresian and Josephine reforms were not only connected with legal, socioeconomic, and religious matters, but also with education. And I'm going to come back to that. Carpatho-Rusyns, our subject, were to be the beneficiaries of reforms in all of these areas, with the result that both mother and son, Maria Theresa and Joseph II, were to be remembered most favorably in Carpatho-Rusyn history. Now, these reforms that were initiated by the Habsburg rulers were intended to apply throughout the empire and to have an impact on all walks of life. The object being to transform medieval Austria into a modern and rational, bureaucratized state. So, for example, beginning again in the 1770s, the beginning of our historic 19th century, most internal tariffs left over from medieval times were abolished. Between 1766 and 1788, criminal procedures were regulated and standardized. Torture was abolished. 1781, an edict of toleration applicable to all religions was adopted and enforced. These reforms had a particularly favorable impact on Carpatho-Rusyns, and specifically in the area of education. Why? Because Maria Theresa in particular restructured the educational system with the intent to produce worthy and responsible subject servants of the state. And to assure that this was done, her son Joseph II, when he came into power by himself, made elementary education compulsory. So already by the 1780s, everyone had to go to school, at least at the elementary level. And most important, education, at least at the elementary level, was to be conducted in the vernacular language of the local region. That is, the national language, the language that people spoke. So you didn't go to school and heard Latin or German, or in the Hungarian kingdom, well, that didn't even exist at that time, in your own language. Crucial. Now, these Theresian and Josephine reforms also had a particularly great impact on the status of the vast majority of the Habsburg realm's inhabitants. It didn't make a difference what their nationality was. In this era, the vast majority of the people were peasants who lived and worked the land. Flashback, 16th century, 1500s. This was a period in the history of the Habsburg realms when serfdom became fully implemented throughout the realm, and that included Carpathian Rus, which is our subject. Already in 1514 in the Hungarian component of the realm, and in 1573 in the non-Hungarian component of the realm. So the 16th century. Not only was serfdom implemented legally in the 16th century, the status of proprietary peasant serfs steadily worsened as the decades and centuries went on. This was particularly problematic for Carpatho-Rusyns, since virtually all of them were peasant serfs. Well, what did this mean? Not only did their number of work days and duties increase that they owed to their landlords, but that increases almost always happened at the arbitrary will of the landlords on the landed estates where a peasant serf, to which it was attached, actually, because the serf was attached to the land. And so the landlord figured, oh, I don't have enough, I need my harvest done because the weather's beautiful. So instead of working 2 days a week, now you got to work 5 days a week, just like that. By the way, it's quite interesting, because we're going to be talking in our lecture next lecture about the role of religion. It's quite interesting that one of the few defenses and effective defenses that peasants had during this period was the possibility that the church would increase the number of holy days on which any kind of work was forbidden. And so suddenly we have this whole host of dreamt up local quote-unquote holidays. Those holidays could be, let's say, the commemoration of the establishment of a particular church, or remembering a disaster that had occurred, a flood, whatever, struck by lightning. These now kinds of local holidays were added to the numerous official saints' days, and often extended holidays surrounding Christmas and Easter. You know, Christmas and Easter in traditional societies in Europe, it's not like here. You get 1 day, maybe 2 days. Canada's pretty good. The United States, you're lucky if Christmas is a holiday, let alone Easter. Canada has a 2nd day. Well, here it was a whole week or even more. By the way, that still continued today, even in post-communist Soviet societies. Christmas and New Year's and Easter has to be minimally a week. Minimally. So, back then, even that much and longer. And so, church holidays came to be appreciated as much for their practical as for their spiritual value. Another result of this arbitrary nature of the feudal system was a general negative attitude toward work that entered the Carpatho-Rusyns social psyche. Work was not something that one did in order to improve one's own personal status. Rather, it was an imposition that one should try to avoid in whatever way possible. After all, an increased workload might improve the resources of the landlord, but not the resources of the peasant serf laborer. Now, the reform-minded Austrian Habsburg rulers set out to change these matters by adopting decrees to regulate the feudal relations between landlords and serfs. Because up until then, the landlord could do what he, in some cases she, wanted. The basic goal then of the Habsburg reformers was threefold. One, to fix the number of serf obligations. Two, to forbid, or at least restrict, the arbitrary confiscation by landlords of land that was allotted to the peasants. And three, in general, to improve economic conditions so that peasants could pay their state taxes. Because the only function of any resident of any state is to do what? What are you here for living in Canada? You're here to pay taxes. And never forget it. And by the way, when you die, believe me, you still have to pay taxes. Sounds strange, but true. Until all the money, whatever you had, is gone. So die poor. Now, the most important decree in this sequence was Maria Theresa's decree called the Urbarium. Urbarium. This was the decree that, for all intents and purposes, moved the property relationship between the landlord and the serf from the private, that is just between them, to the public sphere. This now became a matter of state, and therefore subjected that relationship to regulations set forth by the state. Most importantly, this urbarium guaranteed that the peasant serf, after completing his or her obligations to the landlord, then had the right to dispose of the rest of his or her time as they pleased. In other words, an enterprising peasant might find other employment or even transform his or her obligations into monetary payments. By the way, it was also at this time that the state created village communes or urbarial communes. That is an entity, a territorial entity, which consisted of the arable fields, the pastures, the meadows, and the forests, as well as the dwellings where peasants lived. Now, while this urbarium of Maria Theresa put some order into the relations between the landlord and the serf, it still left extensive power in the hands of the landlords, and in particular the managers of the manorial estates. The managers are always the bad people. For example, the landlord, amongst other things, was given the right to require lazy peasants to work more than the 1 or 2 days per week set out by the decree of Maria Theresa. Of course, who determined what was lazy? Well, we know who determined. Finally, the village commune that I just alluded to was placed under the control of the landlord. And it's not surprising that court cases from subsequent decades, and since everyone was equal before the law, so a peasant could take a landlord to court. And they did. And we have these records filled with all of these suits that are taken out by the peasants against the landlords. So that's how we know that such situation exists. Claims, counterclaims, resulting from these sometimes vague aspects of the regulations that were set out in the Urbarium. Now, as part of the effort undertaken by Habsburg rulers to gain greater control over various aspects of the state, Joseph II in particular turned to the church and to the role of religion in general. In particular, he set out to limit the dominant position of the Roman Catholic Church, which was the official church of the Habsburg Empire. We're going to talk about this in our next lecture, but for the moment, just very briefly. And how to control the Roman Catholic Church? Well, in 1767, he issued, still under his mother's rule, a decree that any orders given by the Roman Catholic Church from Rome could not be proclaimed in churches without prior consent of the Habsburg ruler. So who has priority, the church or the state? And so Joseph II simply says, the secular state. End of story. And of particular importance was Joseph's 1781 Edict of Toleration. I just briefly alluded to it before. What was this? Well, it provided equality for adherents of other faiths. Now, while Roman Catholics were the predominant faith and also the official faith of the Habsburg family, there were living in Habsburg realms also Protestants, both evangelical Lutherans and Reformed Calvinists. There were Orthodox Christians, which we're going to look at, and there were Jews. And even within the Catholic Church, Joseph was intent on implementing the principle of equality. And so for him, the various Catholic rites, again, we're going to talk about this in our next lecture, whether it was the Roman rite or the Byzantine Greek rite or the Armenian rite. People think that everything is Roman Catholic. It's not. He now proclaims them all to be equal, as he said, to be considered three daughters of one mother. Drei Töchter, eine Mutter. Well, to conclude this lecture, if this Theresian Josephine era is not remembered favorably by the Roman Catholic Church, for Carpatho-Rusyns, those very same decades proved to be a crucial and a positive turning point. In effect, their church, which was known as the Uniate Church, which means at the moment nothing to you. Their church became a respected state-supported institution whose very existence was guaranteed by the Habsburg Empire. And after our break, we will return to that particular and other questions.